All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson and I'll be today's moderator. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us to our SMA UK MOD speaker session entitled A New World Order, the West, China and Russia post-COVID. I'd also like to thank today's speakers, Mr. Giles and Mr. Raffaello Pantucci for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session after the brief. And throughout the brief or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles with one containing a question mark. Also, be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you'd prefer for your name not to be recorded, you can submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions that you want answered first by hitting the like button next to the questions. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers before I turn the floor over to them. Mr. Raffaello Pantucci's research focuses on terrorism and counterterrorism, as well as China's relations with its Western neighbors. He currently spends his time between London and Singapore, and he's currently in Singapore, where he's currently completing a writing project looking at Chinese interests in Central Asia under a contract to a major publisher. Mr. Giles is a senior consulting fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. He also works with the Conflict Studies Research Center, or CSRC, which is a group of subject matter experts in Eurasian security, and their particular focus on the wide range of security challenges coming from Russia. Keir also oversees CSRC's research and publication programs, while continuing to focus on his own special interest of Russian military transformation and the Russian approach to cyber and information warfare as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Giles to begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Nicole. Hello, everybody. Russia hasn't seen any reason to adjust its previous views on the dynamics of its relationship with the West and the rest of the world and the direction of travel for those relationships as a result of the pandemic. Instead, it's seen the pandemic accelerating existing trends in those relationships. But those trends, of course, look quite different from Moscow. What Russia thinks it's observing is the eclipse of Western power and the end of a unipolar world, while Russia itself remains strong. It's looking forward to a time when there is no longer such dominance by the United States and its friends, and Russia can wait this process out in order to be able to re-emerge as a major player in, as they see it, a less imbalanced world. And the pandemic has simply helped that process along. They look forward to Russia being forced to reckon with the West on equal terms, and the West having to accept Russia's views of how relationships between states and relationships between states and their own populations should be ordered, instead of, as they have at the moment, the West either ignoring Russia's views or treating what it says and does as unacceptable. Which might take you to the question why, in relative to where Russia has been quite quiet during the pandemic and has not shown us the patterns of assertive behavior that we've seen from, for example, China, which Raffaello will be addressing in just a few minutes. It has been quiet. Of course, it didn't look like that early on. When the pandemic first hit, we had the charm offensives from Russia, the so-called aid to Italy and to the United States, with a multi-track approach, that being accompanied with disinformation campaigns and working through public and private diplomacy, looking for sanctions relief where possible, saying, we're all in this together, let's cooperate, and generally trying to extract maximum concessions while the West was distracted and divided. Looking also to position Russia as a responsible, non-threatening actor, as an alternative in Europe to the European Union, gaining trust among populations, circumventing governments, and trying to speak directly to people whom it could reach. Now, those early campaigns didn't last long. Those attempts to take advantage were largely unsuccessful. In fact, in Italy in particular, it provided a case study of how Russia just doesn't do soft power. The attempts backfired. If you deliver faulty equipment and then personally and publicly threaten the journalists who report when you're having done so, this is an application of what my colleagues like to call the Russian principle of ruthless incompetence, and to some extent, they might have done just as well staying at home. After that early enthusiasm, things appear to have gone quiet, at least as far as we can tell from open sources. There are, of course, continuing disinformation campaigns, preparations to attempt to influence political processes in the United States and elsewhere, including moving on to more sophisticated tools to do so. But all of these are proceeding largely on autopilot. We don't see any new initiatives. Now, in part, that has to be because of Russia's internal distractions. As a general principle, Russia becomes more assertive when it is wealthy. Coronavirus has provided an additional challenge to an economy that was already under severe pressure from an oil price collapse. And that's a big contrast to previous times when Russia has felt flush with oil money and therefore more inclined to assert itself. But also because that assertiveness has generally not been necessary, because some adversaries of Russia are meeting Russian objectives all on their own. That Russian relative disadvantage to the West in global prestige and attraction and the power of attracting allies, the disadvantage is eroding rapidly now that the United States is torpedoing its own soft power. Russia doesn't usually manufacture crises at a major strategic level, however willing it might be to ride them for maximum benefit. It tends not to cause them, but to accelerate or sometimes to intervene to stop them getting worse. So we will see Russia still exploiting Western vacuums of will or of presence if the stakes are high enough or if the risks are low enough, which were the case in Ukraine and Syria. But as a general principle, Russia prefers stability and will not take unnecessary risks. It prefers predictable outcomes, or at least a higher risk of not acting than of taking action. The pandemic makes the situation by definition unpredictable, with a high risk of failure. And Russia's aversion to that is reflected internally, for example, in the way President Putin has distanced himself from antivirus efforts and ensured that it is lower officials that are seen to be taking responsibility and carrying the can when it goes wrong. Unpredictability is a severe restraining factor in Russian action as a rule. But it also leads to the situation we have at the moment, which may cause us to ignore everything I've just said, which is Belarus, where Belarus watchers, of course, are entirely used to hearing that this time it's different, but in fact there are indications that might be severely alarming for Russia in the lack of predictability of the election outcome and events around it that is coming up just in August this year. This, I suspect, is what will lie behind, if it is true, the reports of arrests of Wagner contractors in Belarus and the ongoing information campaigns against Minsk that we're seeing from Russia, probably leading on to more assertive action at a later date, unless the situation does appear to be under control. But overall, for Russia, the signs are encouraging, and Russia could be forgiven for believing that it will be in a position to wait out the West. When Vladimir Putin talks about the West and says that it is in deep internal crisis, for once he's not actually making it up about our countries. Russian disinformation doesn't need to paint pictures of dysfunctional governments, of deep social schisms, of dissatisfied populations, when each of those things is demonstrating itself perfectly satisfactorily already without any need for external assistance. When populations are upset with their governments, when extremes are already taking more and more radical positions, when the middle ground is occupied by fewer and fewer people, Russia needs to exert less effort to stoke up those social divisions and erode social cohesion and undermine the resilience of countries by attacking faith in institutions. And Russia's belief that relative weakness offers a greater role for Russia has been encouraged by attempts at resets. President Macron, more recently Pompeo, saying that Russia is needed, that the West must have Russia on board because of China, implies that Russia will once again be forgiven its sins by the West and therefore be allowed to continue disregarding Western norms and behaving as it wishes. All of the indicators suggest that actually, yes, Russia may be onto something. Meanwhile, how is the pandemic affecting Russia itself? And does this, in fact, provide weaknesses and vulnerabilities in Russia's own stance in the world? Well, again, Russia has a relative advantage there. The situation in Russia is bad, but it's not that much worse than it was already. Yes, there is, as in Western countries, outrage at the government and healthcare responses, but that outrage is relatively muted because there is less shock than in Western countries at missteps by the government, at failings of healthcare systems, because in general, the Russian population, especially outside urban areas, already knew just how bad things were. Poll results from Russia show that the level of confidence in healthcare and in the government is very low. But the experience of the pandemic has had practically no impact. It hasn't made it any lower because everybody already knew what the situation was. And of course, widespread belief that the coronavirus overall is a hoax helps Russia enormously in this regard. Russia had less to lose. But it does have other very real and severe challenges. And that is where we see Russia probably becoming a very different country in a relatively short space of time, in as little as a couple of decades. There are three severe problems that Russia faces and is not apparently taking steps to deal with. The first is the state of the economy, the failure to overhaul and modernize the economy when Russia was flush with cash, to make it less comparatively uncompetitive with the rest of the world. There's still a dependence on exports of raw materials and of energy. There is development in agricultural produce, which is a new factor bolstering the Russian economy, but still, the bulk of the budget is from energy, and that's a resource which has a limited shelf life when people are trying to divest from energy use as rapidly as possible, and is especially vulnerable to shocks like, for example, reduced energy use during coronavirus. Second, there's demography. There's dealing with the consequences, the long-term consequences of the demographic black hole that Russia experienced at the end of the Soviet Union, that biblical gap in population reproduction that is already now fed through conscription age and is now hitting the productive workforce. That's going to accelerate the decline in the proportion of the population of Russia that is actually ethnically Russian. It's going to accelerate population shifts between different parts of the country. It's going to make the country very different economically and socially, simply because of the lack of young Russians to replenish the population. And third, the big one, there's China. And that ongoing contrast between the aggressive language that Russia directs towards NATO and the West and the exceptionally careful language that it uses about China. It is still an utter taboo to admit that there can possibly be any problem in the Chinese relationship. Russia knows that it can beat the West with rhetorical sticks as long as it likes, but the first hint of any problems with China will bring immediate diplomatic and economic and political pain of a kind that Russia cannot afford to tolerate. So, the common factor between all of these different threats facing Russia is denial by the Russian authorities. It is failure to recognize that these are problems, or at least that they will be problems until the current leadership is safely retired and or dead. As a result, instead of attempting to address these major systemic challenges, you see tinkering. You don't disrupt the economy much because, of course, it will cause social upheaval of the kind that Russia saw during the 1990s, not to mention the necessity to redistribute rents and fiefdoms between the people who support President Putin. You don't address the demographic challenge because, after all, there's not so much you can do about it. Certainly, you can pay mothers to have more children, but over and above that, you cannot magic Russians. You cannot be a Cadmus and conjure them up from nowhere. In fact, so desperate were Russia's efforts to look for some way in which they could pretend that the demographic crisis would be resolved was in an earlier version of the national security strategy, where it was the responsibility of the security services within Russia, quote, to stimulate fertility, unquote. No details given on precisely how this was to happen. And China, no recognition whatsoever in Russia's strategic documentation, largely that China even exists. It is a complete blank spot on the map of threats, and it's a blank spot in Russia's plans for how to deal with those threats. At the same time, we do hear about other challenges to Russia which are far less real, but which recur in Western analysis and descriptions of Russia's future. We hear that there will be an imminent economic or political collapse, that the government is unsustainable. There will be the overthrow of Vladimir Putin or the emergence of a real liberal opposition. Unfortunately, we hear these predictions because there are quite a few people who would quite like this to happen. And so the predictions are based rather on optimism than on evidence, and also in some cases of perhaps a misguided appreciation of what would happen if those predictions were to come true, because there would be undesirable consequences. Who wants a Russia that is even less stable and predictable than the one we have at the moment? Who wants a Russian leadership that is more in keeping with Russian historical patterns and less relatively benign and liberal like the one we have at the moment? Put it all together and you have a situation where Russia will still be there. Russia is likely to emerge ready from the pandemic as the West is still finding its feet and ready to deploy that opportunism and willingness to seize the moment, not reduced. This will still be a factor as the West is recovering from COVID. Russia will be ready to move fast and break things if the opportunity arises. And that is not at the moment just misbehavior for relevance, which we do see, the kind of classic attention-seeking behavior that meets Russia's status anxiety. Instead, increasingly as time goes by, we'll see Russia grappling with this decline based on systemic factors and in a relatively short space of time. As its acceleration backwards becomes undeniable, we will see the move towards both internal and external upheaval that we, as the West, will have to deal with. Thank you, Nicole. That's it from me for now.
All right, thank you. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Pantucci.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good whatever time of day it is, wherever you happen to be. For me, it's the evening here in Singapore, but I'm delighted to join you and thank you to colleagues for the kind invitation to come and talk to you today. So I'm going to talk in my comments at a very sort of high geopolitical level in many ways to try to tell the story of COVID and China and how it's kind of seen from Beijing's perspective and how we've seen things play out, and try to offer some explanation for why Beijing has been behaving in the way that it is, and also highlighting some of the problems that have emerged as a result of what China has been doing. So if we think back to the beginning of the year, when COVID first started to emerge, we started at a moment when China was really starting to feel a greater sense of pressure from the world. The discussions with the United States were sort of moving in a sputtering direction. The trade talks hadn't moved very far, and we were seeing the big discourse was very much focused around Huawei and around the world trying to close Huawei out of international Western structures in particular. Countries were sort of rejecting the company, and it was becoming kind of a proxy for China in general. And so you had a sense of China was coming into this virus, facing a lot of problems on the world stage. And so when everything started to happen within China, we had the additional problems of the handling and the management of the disease within China. When the outbreak first happened in Wuhan, if it actually happened and started happening in Wuhan or maybe somewhere nearby, but it seems very clear that it started somewhere in the city, or the first sort of major outbreak happened within the city. It's not clear the degree to which the reporting was done very accurately internally. It's not clear how much Beijing really knew what was actually going on. It's not very clear, all the sort of functioning systems that should have happened to manage such a crisis, because this is not the first time China's had a crisis of this sort before. They've had SARS previously, H1N1. There's been lots of sort of viruses of this sort that have been through the region. So there are systems in place within China to try to deal with these problems. They kind of failed, and the system was having a lot of trouble. And there was a lot of public concern and complaint about what was happening. And we saw the government feeling under a great deal of pressure that they were really facing and not handling this domestic problem quite substantially. So they had an awkward situation of just distrust abroad and tensions and complications at home. And initially we saw them taking a certain amount of medical aid was coming into China. A lot of other countries saw what was happening in China and wanted to help, provided aid. And the Chinese were very careful about how this aid was received. They didn't want to broadcast it. They made a very big point in particular, for example, with the Europeans saying, yes, we'd love your aid. Thank you very much. But, could we please do it discreetly, because this is a very important face issue for us. But then after a while, they started to get some sense of control over what was going on. They started to impose their very, heavy lockdowns on major cities. They started really shutting down their economy in a very dramatic and painful way, but in such a way that actually started to get a grip on the problem that they were facing. And we started to see the narrative change. And China started to say, well, now we've started to deal with our problem, we can start to help the world. And you started to see a big narrative of medical diplomacy going out. And China starting to push this story of now we fixed our problems, we'll start sending medical aid to other parts of the world, ventilators where they're needed, masks that we mass produce in our country already, we can send them around the world. And they started to do this in a very visible and public way. And we saw Chinese companies stepping forwards and private sector stepping forwards to actually continue doing this aid. We saw a very big sort of medical diplomacy push going out into the world. But it came out in such a way where we saw that the tensions with China that had already sort of been underlying had started to pick up now. As the virus started to impact around the world, people started to complain about what was actually happening, how questions about the reliability of Chinese data, questions around why had China hidden this in the first place, how China was responsible in some way for this, on top of all the other problems we already had with Beijing. And we saw that this medical aid actually didn't land exactly in the way that China wanted it to. Now, in some places, it was quite positively received. But in an awful lot of countries, there was a sense that, in many ways, what we saw Keir describing with the Russian attempts of sending aid to Italy, a lot of the aid that was sent by China to Europe didn't work, was faulty, was problematic in some way. And because it was delivered in this very sort of lofty tone of saying, we're coming and bringing aid to these developed countries that can't handle a problem that we've managed to handle, when these countries had sent aid to China in a very sort of magnanimous way first, gave a very bad taste across lots of countries who started to get quite frustrated with what they saw as China's behavior. But at the same time, within China, the problem was really starting to get under control. And we saw that, and we can see now, that the economy in China has really started to get moving once again. If you talk to people who live in major Chinese cities, they do suffer from occasional outbreaks. I think Beijing was suffering from an outbreak of some sort. We saw one in Dalian quite recently. But the narrative very much changed, where there was a sense that we've got the virus under control at home, and now the problem is outside. And you started to see sometime in sort of April, May, the narrative started to shift from being a problem that was coming from within China to being a problem that was outside China that was being brought back from troublesome countries abroad that were not managing their problems, that were then having their people or Chinese nationals who were living there were coming back to China, were kind of bringing the disease with them. And we saw the narrative really shift that said that we've got a control of this at home. It's the external world that hasn't got it under control and actually is now causing us problems. And so we really saw that sense of confidence starting to build up within China. And we see a sense that actually we've figured out how to crack this code of this virus and the rest of the world has just been unable to. And therefore our system is actually quite good and our system is actually quite effective. And we start to see this then spilling out into other areas as well, where the government starts to advance a narrative that was already existing there and that we can see very much through the entire kind of Xi Jinping era, that China is the kind of ascendant power. It is now one of the big powers on the world stage. There is the China dream that it is trying to sort of realize, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese country, the rejection of 100 years of humiliation at the hands of the West, and very much a sort of positive narrative, a China that is strong and big and powerful on the world stage. And so we see this starting to spill out in all sorts of directions, and we see them pushing outwards in lots of sort of areas where there have been long-standing issues, long-standing tensions, long-standing problems, but we see China acting much more confidently. We see people in Beijing starting to talk about maybe now is the moment to do something about Taiwan. We see the decision to impose the national security law, losing the logic of the protests that had really, crippled Hong Kong for the past year as a sort of pretext to try to bring this legislation in. We see the narratives around what's going on in Xinjiang, the crackdown there being pushed out in a very sort of bullish direction of saying, we're handling a domestic terrorist problem here and we're dealing with it in our way. And you see them pushing out on borders with India. You see these borders with India that have always been very ill-defined and quite specifically so, were suddenly pushed in a different direction. We saw the PLA using this as an opportunity to try to push and probe and see how far they could get with India. We see on the South China Sea, Chinese boats being far more sort of probing in their activity and their movements towards some of these disputed waters where they have historical conflicts with some of their neighbors. And we see generally China trying to push themselves out in every direction and trying to see how far they can sort of take advantage of the current situation. And the reason they've been able to do this is on the one hand, because at home, the narrative is very much one of we're riding high on a crest, and so let's take advantage of that and move forwards. But also because they got a sense that on the world stage, there was a degree of confusion. First, the rest of the world was suffering from COVID and having difficulty managing it and facing all sorts of problems. Second, we had, frankly, a world order that wasn't coming together to directly confront on issues that they said they were all together about. Frankly, a United States absent leadership on the world stage in terms of advancing, taking a strong stand and sticking to it, and bringing allies along to actually confront some of the issues that they face, and frankly, a lot of allies agree with about China, meant that people were kind of uncertain exactly, as to what they were getting behind. And the fact that, frankly, from Washington, you sometimes got a mixed message of, was Washington really going to push on something, or was it actually something that might get undermined by some sort of presidential directive or executive order at the last minute? And so this created a sense of instability on the world stage. But for China, it was an opportunity, a sense that there was a moment here where they could push their borders out. They could push on lots of things that they've always been pushing forwards on. But now they could do it at a moment where they were likely to face a very confused response. And so in a way, they could reshape the realities on the ground in a whole series of contexts, and do that in such a way that when we see maybe some sort of stability returning to the world order, possibly later this year, that at that point they would be negotiating from a different place, from a place where they've changed the status on the ground, and therefore they're no longer, they don't have to give these things up at this point because they've sort of claimed them, but at the same time they can negotiate back, or they can sort of calm things down from a different and changed position on the ground. But all of this narrative of kind of a sense of pushing out, a sense of great strength and victory, has a problem within it. And this is a problem that I think is becoming much more acute, and we can see it becoming much more problematic for Beijing in the past few weeks, really. And this is a sense of hubris that has started to slip in. On the one hand, we always have to remember that when we look at China, we have to think about it in different contexts. If you're looking at China from the perspective of a neighboring country to China, you're seeing the world's now second largest economy, still a very large economic motor, a very important player, a very powerful player that sits right on your border or right near you. And so whatever happens within it will have some sort of a knock-on effect on you. And so when you're sitting in some of these Asian countries, they may be quite concerned about China, but at the same time, they have a relationship with China which has to work and has to function, because otherwise it will do huge damage to them themselves. So this creates a different kind of context within these places of how they will engage with China. And so actually, you can see the narratives around medical diplomacy, while when they hit Europe and had all the problems that I talked about before, it was received quite negatively. You can see in its immediate borders, actually, they weren't received quite so negatively. It was actually seen in a more positive light. Now, there was all sorts of problems within that I can go into if people are interested. But I think the key thing to remember is that the relationship there is a very different one. But I think what you've started to see is that China has started to pick fights in its immediate periphery in really quite unnecessary ways that ultimately reflect, I think, a sense that China is given itself a great sense of manifest destiny within its immediate neighborhood, and a sense of great power over these countries around it, in such a way that actually is starting to undermine these countries' comfort with China and their willingness and their sense of how they have to survive and how they have to live next to China. And so if we look at, for example, the clash that we've seen with India, it was an entirely unnecessary border spat that was started because of a sort of an Indian infrastructure construction that China objected to and decided to react quite negatively to, and then that escalated into a series of spats that we saw a number of people die, a number of soldiers die on both sides as a result of. But the initial sort of trigger for this was one that probably China didn't need to necessarily escalate in such a way. And then subsequently, it wasn't necessarily necessary for China to continue to sort of push back on India in the way that we've seen it subsequently do. The truth is that India, led by President Modi, even though it's a country that has sort of made a lot of discussion recently about its close alliance with the United States, its desire to be part of the Quad, it has always historically wanted to have a productive relationship with China. And actually, under President Modi, you'd seen a lot of steps being taken in a more positive direction to the China-India relationship than, frankly, we'd seen some time before that. And so the decision, in some ways, by China to first have this border spat get picked and then choose to escalate it up, and then choose ultimately to use it as a diplomatic cudgel to continue to hit Delhi, has actually undermined a relationship that frankly was pretty stable and probably moving in a positive direction. Similarly, if we look at Central Asia, countries that by force of geography are forced to have a very strong relationship with China, that actually aren't that, they're concerned about it, and there are lots of issues around Central Asia and their fear of China and the sort of fear of China is overwhelming. At the same time, there is a recognition that this is an important economic powerhouse that they need to have some sort of connection with. It's also an important security actor for them. So they recognize all of these things. And yet what we've seen over the past few weeks is that sort of rhetorical spats around online material that is emanated from China that has sort of seemed to undermine the sense of nationhood in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan has actually created a diplomatic spat between these countries. We've seen China pairing up with Russia to advance this conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 virus actually emanated from some of these non-Luger labs that were created in the wake of the Cold War to try to sort of protect, to try to, decommission and render safe some of the biolabs that have that were left across the sort of former Soviet belt. And some of the ones in Kazakhstan have been specifically pointed to as potentially the source of the virus. This, of course, caused huge consternation in Kazakhstan, accusing them of being responsible for this global catastrophe. And this, again, was a relationship that, frankly, was moving in a very positive direction. And so we can see that sense of kind of undermining things that really didn't need to actually be undermined. Similarly with Pakistan, we can see that China has been pushing very strong on Pakistan, in part because of frustration at what we've seen happen with the Imran Khan government, not necessarily delivering on a number of things that Beijing, I think, hoped that they were going to deliver on the China-Pakistan economic corridor and other things. But at the same time, the push that we've seen from Beijing has been so strong that it's now started to generate a feeling within Islamabad of great concern about being so firmly placed on the Chinese side of the docket as we see this great sort of Cold War descending on the world. There is the sense of sort of overdependence really slipping in. The point is that all of these countries are ones that realize they have to have a relationship with China. They realize that China isn't all a bad thing from their perspective. And they realize that no matter what happens, at the end of the day, China will still be there. And so however the dust settles, however the cards fall, they will still be adjacent to China. It will still be a major economic powerhouse. So these are countries that instinctively have to have some sort of a functioning modus vivendi with Beijing. They don't want to have to choose between Beijing and the United States. They don't want to have to choose at all. And so they don't really like the hectoring from both sides. But at the same time, with Beijing, it's becoming very difficult now because we are seeing this real sense of hubris come in and a real sense of China pushing out as far as it can and seeing what it can get away with at this moment, and not really caring seemingly about the consequences amongst a series of powers that frankly are inclined probably to be its allies. And I have come, I think, to the end of my time, so I will draw it to a stop there, and I look forward to questions, disagreements, shouting back, whatever. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A chat. And if you would like to vote on the questions that you would like to hear most, there is an option to vote in the Q&A as well. All right, so our first question is from someone with DSTL, and they've asked, how has the pandemic affected the relationship between Russia and China rather than their relationship with the West?
Well, if I take the view from Moscow and then hand over to Raffaello for how it looks from the other side, very little, it seems. There's been very little effect on the relationship, similarly to Russia's relationship with the rest of the world. Now, in the very early stages of the pandemic, one of the key narratives that was coming from Moscow was, we have this under control because we closed the border with China early. There was a few things about that statement that were completely untrue, but that was the closest that Russia has actually come to leveling any kind of criticism at China for what's gone on. And this fits in with the pattern of not under any circumstances pointing to any kind of problem with China. Now, Raffaello mentioned just a moment ago the apparent confluence between Russian and Chinese approaches, particularly on information handling of the pandemic, on pointing disinformation about where the virus may have come from. I think that is entirely coincidental. I think it is Russia seeing an opportunity and it fitting into its existing patterns of narratives, similarly to the way we've seen China, in fact, imitating Russian techniques as part of its new assertiveness with information campaigns, not just pushing a single overriding narrative that it wants to convince the world of, but also tackling what's sometimes referred to as the Russian model of simply sowing chaos in order to confuse and destabilize the people you're pointing at. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's part of a coordinated campaign, as opposed to just learning from each other where you have those shared objectives. So from Moscow's perspective, really, it has not changed very much. How does it look from Beijing, Raf?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think my sense is, I'll pick up a word that Keir used before, which is acceleration. I think acceleration has been a sort of big buzzword in some ways of COVID-19 and the sort of fallout from it. And I think what in some ways we've seen happen is a kind of acceleration of a pattern of activity we'd seen before, which is that the relationship with China, with Russia, has been strengthened at a kind of geostrategic level. And I think we can see that in some of the statements that we've seen emanating, some of the sort of construction of an almost trifecta with Iran of powers that are all sort of confronting the West at the same time and are sort of trying to push back on the West. But at the same time, I think we are seeing that a certain degree of Beijing maybe being a bit more assertive, I think, in its relationship towards Moscow than maybe we'd seen previously. I think previously the narrative was always, well, it's Russia, the one that's the great kind of disruptor on the world stage, and China is not. I think we're seeing, in particular, in terms of the relationship with the United States, China is becoming much more sort of confrontational in that regard, and really starting to point fingers in ways that they hadn't before, and doing things that are quite specifically a poke in the eye to the United States that previously they probably wouldn't have done, and they'd let the Russians do. So, for example, if we look back a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, I can't even remember right now, Sergei Lavrov and Wang Yi had a phone call, which got a certain amount of traction, because what we saw afterwards was the comments that were released. Wang Yi was very snide, very aggressive in some of his commentary about the United States, very undiplomatic in some ways. And we saw the write-up that the Russian MFA put out by Sergei Lavrov was actually a bit more muted. It mentioned the United States, but it mentioned in a far less kind of finger-pointing way than we'd seen before. And that's an interesting kind of reversal in some ways that we've seen. If we look at what China has been doing with Iran, for example, it's now very clear, this big 25-year deal that they're signing, the Chinese are not hiding the fact that this is quite clearly being done to poke the United States in the eye. And so that was something that the Chinese were probably a bit more circumspect about before, and was something that they would more leave to the Russians, whereas now we can see that they're taking a much more forward view on that. And I think that is, to some degree, probably filtering down to probably a pushier perspective on Russia to kind of be on side on the world stage. I think the Chinese have always been a bit concerned that Russia might actually go soft on them in the sort of confrontation with the West. There's always that fear of, what's described as the reverse Kissinger. This idea of, Russia being peeled away from China, and this is something that Beijing does worry about. And I think what you'll see happen in the short to medium term future is a continuing push by Beijing to make sure that does not happen, and to continue to get big statements of fealty from Russia towards the kind of geostrategic relationship and alignment with Beijing.
All right, thank you both. So our next question is, what is the future of Russia in the Pacific? Will they deter to Chinese power, or aim to leverage Chinese power to further Russian Pacific interests?
I think it's highly likely that you will see deference where there is an overlap, where there is actually a competition between Russia and China. Now, fortunately for both of them, up until that point, not only in the Pacific but elsewhere, the interests of the two have not actually clashed. We've seen them operating in the same space in a number of different areas. Central Asia for the longest period, Africa more recently, but each country wants different things out of those relationships. Now, when Russia is undertaking this program of expanding its global influence that we've seen just over the last 2 to 2.5 years, with apparently new objectives from what it had previously, seeking influence not just when it's specifically tied to specific economic benefits or political influence in a particular place, but apparently just because, and spreading itself thin, including across the Pacific. The tangible benefits of that at the moment seem to be just political support on specific issues at specific times, which is very different from how China would frame its own interest in expanding influence and control in the Pacific. So up until now, it seems that whether it is deliberate or whether it is simply because the interests are so far apart, there's been successful deconfliction. I don't see that as lasting, as both sides actually continue to seek to expand where they can reach and where they can exert influence. But when the two do clash, I would very much expect it, in keeping with everything Raphael and I have said already, that it would be Russia that would back down and recognize that it cannot be in that kind of competition with Russia. And again, the phrase that Raphael had used just now, we might see expressions of fealty, whether it's in word or in deeds. Raphael, how do you see it?
I mean, I'd agree with Keir. I think that it's not a field of competition. I think what's always struck me as fascinating in some ways is, and this probably speaks more to Moscow in some ways than Beijing, but Russia's ability to frankly sell weapons to both sides of conflict. And I think that speaks a lot to Russia's ability to be able to manage and compartmentalize its relationships. And if we think, for example, about India, right? I mean, Russia's a huge supplier of weapons and hardware to India. What we saw after the clash with China was, a beeline being made to Moscow to buy new defense systems. So it's very clear that there you have a situation where, a direct clash with a competitor has led to that competitor going directly to Moscow, and Beijing seems okay with this, So I think that they do seem to have an ability between themselves to compartmentalize these things. And I think, as Keir said, were we to get to a context where you'd have a clash, I have a feeling that Moscow's strategic sense is, their antenna, let's say, are well tuned enough to know at what point they can sort of push things and get away with things to what degree before they would cross a sort of Chinese line. But I think, frankly, the question from Beijing's perspective is probably mostly around, is there a point at which a Chinese border is kind of threatened, or Chinese national integrity is threatened? I think as long as Moscow doesn't undermine that, I think basically the two will be able to find a way of living comfortably together. But let me pass it back to you, Nicole, for the next one.
All right, our next question is from someone from NORAD and US Northcom, and they've said, how can the West more effectively strategically compete below the level of conflict with Russia?
I really wouldn't advise competing below the level of conflict. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's see this from a Russian perspective. They see themselves as already being in a conflict, and the most effective way to deal with that is to recognize that that is the case. For as long as we pretend that we're actually at peace with Russia, we're going to be constrained in the possible range of responses. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean going to all-out military clashes, but in all of those domains where Russia is unrestrained because it considers itself to be already at war, simply recognizing that, acknowledging it, avowing it publicly, and informing our own populations of what is going on more effectively than we've done up until now is one of the strongest weapons in dealing with it. And there's a successful case study of how that might work. We've seen this trend toward greater transparency in exposing the fine detail of what Russia is doing, and international cooperation in transparency. But it's not consistent. Some things get shown up, some things get reported. Others, for example, the day-to-day drumbeat of activities that are run against NATO and by Russia, are simply not in the public consciousness. But take what happened after the attacks on the Skripals in Salisbury. That was a case study of how transparency and international cooperation and a limited release of information can actually have second and third order consequences, which are in fact quite damaging for Russia. So letting everybody know what is happening, releasing sufficient information that you can outsource the exposure of what is going on to the world's media, and especially to media in Russia itself, is extremely effective, because look at what happens after that. The unrestrained Russian investigative reporting that leads to the exposure of hundreds of other GRU officers, which must necessarily have been a setback for the Russian authorities. So being open about it, being honest about it, letting the population know what is going on, and most of all, simply recognizing that we are not below the level of conflict in any domain except the very strictly defined one of military clashes.
Okay, our next question is from Clifford Zins, Z-I-N-N-E-S, from the University of Chicago. And the question is, can you speak to China's efforts to gain influence in developing countries and what means that they're using?
I mean, I think that, the easy and cheap answer is money, but I actually think it's far more sophisticated and complicated than that. And I'm going to use a specific case study, which is one that I've done a lot of work on, but I think it's one that actually you can see in lots of other contexts as well, is if we look at Central Asia. And we look at the countries of Central Asia. Now, of course, the relationship with them is different maybe to ones in Africa because the fact that they're adjacent, but actually a lot of the playbook you can see in Central Asia is what I would argue you can see in lots of other places as well. And it's, on the one hand, it is about infrastructure investment, the sort of Belt and Road that we talk about. This idea of kind of offering big loans to these countries on terms actually that are very competitive with international financial institutions, by the way. These are not, I think the debt trap diplomacy is probably a bit of a, it's not a totally accurate characterization, frankly, of a lot of what happens. A lot of the money is being borrowed on terms which these countries, which, I've heard people at IFI say, yes, this is very competitive, and, we would encourage these countries to take it on. They need to be careful about how much they take on. But ultimately, they take these loans on. These loans are usually linked loans or, where they have to then use a Chinese company to come and deliver a piece of infrastructure. So that's kind of the classic one model. But I think what's interesting is if you look at it at multiple different levels as well, you can also see there is a kind of soft power push that's tried. Now, it doesn't always work. And frankly, it's a bit clumsy in a lot of places. Sort of Chinese ambassadors writing op-eds in newspapers doesn't really move the dial. But what does instead in a sort of longer term trajectory is the fact that they offer a lot of scholarships to kids from these countries to go back to China and study. They set up Confucius Institute so people can learn Mandarin. And if you're sitting in Central Asia and you're a trader or you come from a trading family, actually having a child who can speak Mandarin, that means they can go to Guangzhou, the Canton Fair, and directly negotiate and barter with people that are there to get goods that ultimately you're going to sell on to other markets, is a pretty good thing. And you're going to immediately inculcate in that individual, a connection to China that kind of wasn't there before. You can also see, if we look at in the e-commerce space, we can see that Alibaba is increasingly dominant in the Central Asian countries in particular. We can see a lot of commerce comes through those through that platform. And Alibaba or JD.com, which is sort of Amazon equivalents that you have in China. If we look at e-learning, for example, which has been a big thing during COVID, of course, we've seen that there's some big Chinese e-learning platforms that have actually been pushing with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and with the support of the Chinese state into Central Asia to actually offer their services. And so you can see now people in these countries are using, e-learning platforms made in China to ultimately, to help their children study in this sort of bizarre moment. If we think about medical diplomacy, and we think about not only it's about sending kit and sending stuff, but we've also had situations where Chinese have translated some of the manuals and some of the textbooks that they've generated at home to try to manage the virus and how they've managed to do that successfully. There's been translated into local languages and sort of distributed freely and widely. If we think about the fact that they've set up these sort of regular webinar engagements platforms, much like we are today, where you have Chinese doctors talking to their counterparts in Central Asia saying, well, ask me questions. Was there anything? How are you handling the virus? What problems are you having? Maybe I can tell you from my experience what we found. They're doing lots of these sorts of soft connections that are really spreading out across the board. And I think that's really the point, is that we have a habit, I think, of getting fixated on the fact that, the China relationship with these countries is purely a sort of commercial one. They arrive with a big checkbook, they'll say, here's some money, use our companies, build some infrastructure, you're our friend, right? Well, no, it's actually a far more complicated and sophisticated relationship than that. And I think what's interesting is in the longer term, what are the consequences of having these many, many different touch points between China and these countries? And that, I think, is the kind of longer term play, I think, and the longer term impact and influence that I think you're going to see playing out over the next, 10 to 15 year timeline. And I think the final point to remember is one that even when we talk about the big infrastructure, we look at this sat in the West and say, this is about poor countries taking on more debt that they can handle, or this is about countries not having stuff built that they don't necessarily need. We would prefer, that they did build something else instead. But that's not necessarily how it's seen on the ground. And actually, when we look into the detail of a lot of the projects that happen, the Chinese do actually employ quite a few people on the ground. They tend not to employ at the high level, so the sort of managerial positions and the engineering levels. But if you look at the sort of grassroots level, actually there are a lot of local sort of employees, which means lots of people who ultimately have their kind of, daily meal and their paycheck coming from a Chinese firm. So, there's a whole web of these sorts of contacts and connections that you can see that operate very much at a sort of state and less prominent level that actually has an impact cumulatively on these countries and their perceptions and their relationship with China. So I hope that helps answer it a bit. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. So our next question is from FSO Paul Tyson, and he said, how important will oil and gas be in the future for revenues and diplomatic leverage with neighbors?
Can we get an indication of which country we're talking about?
He doesn't specify.
Okay, well, I'll do Russia briefly. Of decreasing importance, not only because countries have long recognized the problem of dependence on Russia for energy imports, but also now because they are actually in a position to do something about it. Russia uses this tool and has used this tool repeatedly, going back much further than we tend to recall. And as a result, countries that neighbor Russia have constructed their energy policies accordingly. You see electricity interconnectors across the Gulf of Finland, LNG terminals in Latvia, et cetera, all designed to reduce that leverage at the same time as, whenever possible, reducing reliance on fossil fuels altogether. Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 are there, but are not a surprise. Everybody has seen this coming and trying to make sure that their vulnerability is reduced as a result.
So, I mean, very briefly, from a Chinese perspective, I think that, Beijing is, of course, a monster economy that's continuing to grow that needs oil and gas. But I think what they have done is really diversify their sources of input. So they really are reliant on a range of different actors, and they've got lots of construction happening and lots of other new energy prospects, which frankly are coming from a very wide range of places. So the old dilemma that they used to have, the famous Malacca dilemma of, having the Malacca Straits as being this one choke point, which, if it was taken out, then Chinese economy would be doomed because the amount of oil that came through there, has now been kind of overtaken by pipelines that they built in Southeast Asia, into Central Asia, and into Russia. So, and this has also given them an interesting degree, actually, of back leverage on some of these partners, where some of these partners are now actually becoming dependent on China for their, government coffers to grow. So that is actually flipping the kind of relationship back, and China's done in such a way as to really create a plurality of entry points for oil and gas into its country. I mean, it is no longer as utterly dependent on some as it was in the past. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. We have another question from DSTL, and the person said, will COVID-19 help or hinder the Chinese government in its Belt and Road Initiative?
I mean, I think, I could go into a very, very long and boring presentation and additional presentation about the Belt and Road if you all really wanted to go to sleep. But I think the quick thing I would say is that there's a couple of things. One is we have to think of the Belt and Road slightly differently from being a specific project. It's really a concept. This is Xi Jinping's big foreign policy idea, the idea of building trade and connectivity corridors around the world to ultimately connect China up to the world, but ultimately for everyone to be prosperous. And, basically they were trying to articulate their foreign policy vision as, let's all make money together. Who doesn't like that? So that was the kind of appealing narrative, but it really was a kind of a vision rather than a specific set of projects. Now, under the vision, there are, of course, lots of individual projects. And I think what's interesting about those projects is, frankly, I think a lot of them, the logic of them will only get stronger in some ways, because these countries that are receiving the investment and the infrastructure will want it, and want it even more in a situation of, a tightening global economy. I think the thing about the Belt and Road and the slowdown you're going to see was actually happening pre-Belt and Road, and it was happening COVID. And it was happening really because there was a growing sense of concern in Beijing that actually what was happening around the world with these projects was maybe being a bit more wasteful than they wanted it to be. And there was a sense that actually we've ended up investing in a lot of countries where it's not totally clear how quickly these guys are going to be able to pay this back. It's not totally clear whether we're actually going to be able to deliver the project ever because of problems on the ground. And we've done this in dozens of countries all at the same time. And, yes, China's huge and has a lot of money, but, money isn't infinite, and there's also a huge domestic population that need a lot of things done for them as well. So, I think we have to sense there was a kind of slowdown already happening with the Belt and Road or Belt and Road projects pre-BRI. So I think that slowdown will kind of continue. The logic of kind of, the concept of Belt and Road will continue post COVID. And I think the logic of some of the individual projects will continue post-COVID, but at the slower pace that we'd already seen starting to happen pre-COVID-19. Thank you. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, our next question is from Nathan Johnson from US Air Force, among other affiliations. And he said, do you know of any direct effect of COVID on Chinese or Russian military operations? For example, exercises canceled, bases temporarily closed?
On the Russian side, no, I don't, but of course that doesn't mean it isn't happening. If you're working exclusively from open sources, if the official line is no, everything's proceeding as normal, it's a little bit hard to drill down behind that and see what's really happening. Now, Russia does have some relatively plausible explanations for why nothing's changing or nothing's getting cancelled. And one of the points that they make when you engage in conversation on this is that, by and large, the kind of units that we're talking about within Russia, unlike in the militaries of other countries, are isolated. are remote, don't have that much interaction with the surrounding communities. Entry and exit from them is generally controlled, and as a result, you've got effectively self-isolating military populations who are going to be that much less vulnerable to what's happening in the big cities. But in terms of the granular detail of what has and hasn't been affected, I'm afraid that's simply not visible to people like me.
I have to agree with Kira. I haven't seen much evidence of this. I think there were reports of some of the peacekeeping missions that we had Chinese forces deployed on in parts of Africa being quite concerned about their situations. But as far as I know, I don't think it's had any sort of hugely material impact on the Chinese military and their capabilities. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. So our next question is from Bob Elder from George Mason University. And he said, is Russia seeing growth in minority populations that could create new domestic social instabilities in the future?
Yes and no. Yes, very much so to the growth, not so much to the new domestic social instabilities. The proportions of the population of Russia are changing very rapidly because of the decline in the proportion of ethnic Russians at the same time as you have much greater fertility rates among the southern republics, and of course net immigration coming particularly from Central Asia, but also from other destinations that see Russia as an attractive place to be. So while the headline figures for Russian population appear to have stabilized, when you drill down, that actually masks a very different picture if you're talking about actual Russians, the Russkie as opposed to the Rossiyskiy, which is the country as a whole. So yes, minority populations are increasing rapidly. Does that create new domestic social instabilities? No, because all of those instabilities are already there. It does exacerbate them and it does accelerate them. But the problems that you see as a result of these dynamics, for example, the retreat of ethnic Russians from the North Caucasus, or race riots across Russia where ethnic Russians and the other nationalities take up arms against each other, all of that has been happening for a very long time. There's nothing new about those particular threats, but yes, it will get worse as the Russian population, the pure Russian population, feels itself to be more and more embattled.
All right, thank you. So for everyone's situational awareness, our speakers have kindly agreed to stay on 15 minutes extra after the hour. So we will be continuing until about 11:15. So, okay, a question from Q in Tampa. And the question is for Raf. And he said, how do you see ASEAN going forward vis-a-vis their relationship with the West and with the PRC?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. I think ASEAN is a grouping that is very much feels itself at the heart of this, the sort of devil's horn, if you will, of the dilemma of being stuck between the US and China. I mean, the ASEAN has always had an issue with certain countries within the institution being more sort of blocking progress on certain issues, maybe confrontations, joint statements about China. And that has caused problems within the organization to try to get them all to sort of rally to a common line on that. But it's also created a difficulty for them in terms of rallying to get a common line with the United States. So I think they're finding themselves in a very sort of complicated moment at this moment. And I don't know that, frankly, it's going to change a huge amount now. I think you've seen some toughening in some ways of the line with the Philippines. The Philippines was a power that seemed to be more leaning towards the PRC, and now it seems to be leaning away. And so that's having a material relationship. But I think the point I would make would be to go back to my presentation, which would be to say that, these are all countries that are very close to China, that are concerned, and, they worry. I mean, you may or may not remember, it was a few years ago where Yang Jiechi, and he was then the foreign minister, but he's now the state councillor for foreign policy, basically at an ASEAN forum, basically said, well, there are big countries and there are small countries, and small countries kind of need to learn their place, in a very undiplomatic moment, a surprising moment in many ways for a Chinese diplomat. But, that really worried people in ASEAN, because it really started to give them a sense of what have we got here, and that really kind of pushed them towards being more more willing and closer to the United States. Now, I think with the hubris we're seeing at the moment coming out of Beijing, it's possible that you'll see that narrative start to return, that sense of concern. But structurally, ASEAN has this issue of some powers within it are closer to China, and because of various issues, including, frankly, leadership issues, are never going to sort of veer away from that. And that will always, to some degree, stymie the organization being able to sort of rally a common line against the PRC. So thank you. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. So our next question is, of the three countries, the US, China, Russia, which one holds the current advantage when it comes to using information to manage global activity towards its own ends?
I think we can rule out the United States because, unfortunately, it being a relatively liberal democracy, it's constrained by the rule of law and what it does to other countries. That leaves China and Russia. China, I think we don't put in the running at this point because, unlike Russia, it simply has not exerted its power in quite such a hostile manner, except, as we spoke about earlier, to deliver very specific targeted narratives to convince people in the rest of the world about very specific things. Russia, on the other hand, has had this broad-based approach at a huge range of levels of ambition, from regime change through information means right at the very top end, so changing fundamental state policy or who's actually in power, right down just to sedition, to subversion, to undermining social cohesion, and with this zero-sum view of security, taking the view that anything that weakens the adversary is actually good for Russia. So simply because we have seen it implemented on so many different levels and through so many different means, setting aside the headlines on disinformation activities through social media, there's all of the other ranges of malign influence that come through academia, through business, through politics, through, as we've seen in the Russia report here in the UK, through members of the House of Lords. There is so much of that and is being used so constantly that I think we have to put Russia in pole position when you ask that question. Rafaela, did you have a different view?
No, I mean, I have to agree, frankly. I think that, I think Kier's right. Russia is certainly way ahead of the game on this one. I think Beijing's actually still figuring out how to deliver its messaging in a way that actually influences. I think the problem at the moment is, frankly, what we hear from Beijing is hectoring, really. And it's something that is not going to really persuade many minds. This is why I'm often a bit surprised at the degree to which people say, China's exerting this sort of massive influence, behind the scenes in Western democracies, when, frankly, I think they do that amongst Chinese-speaking populations. So if you have sort of a Chinese minority, you can see a lot of activity going specifically on them, but it's very much focused on making sure they're staying online on certain key sort of Chinese messages. And that's really what they're focused on. And that's what they've, I think, been able to do relatively effective in terms of quieting these communities. In terms of broad-based influence, I mean, just look at, find me a sort of positive story in a Western newspaper about China. I struggle, frankly. So I don't think that they're actually very good at doing that yet. And it's still something that I think I'd agree with Kier. Russia's kind of way ahead in terms of knowing what they're trying to do and kind of achieving the outcome that they want. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, our next question is from Todd Vesey from SMA. And he said, could you comment about how Chinese and Russian populations are viewing all of this in terms of the governing social contract? Are we seeing any kind of fundamental shift, and does that point to future instability? Sorry, future political instability.
Rafaela, did you want to go first for a change?
Happy to. I think that I actually think that this is not having a negative effect, frankly, within China. I think initially, at the beginning of the virus outbreak, I think, Beijing did feel under pressure politically. You had videos emerging of, people shouting at senior leaders when they were going to visit Wuhan. Really surprising stuff. There's a great deference sort of to leadership, and, the fact that these A, were happening, and B, that they leaked out, I think reflected a real anger at how things were being handled and how things were being managed. And I think you switch that to today, where they look and they say, well, look, the world's in chaos. The United States has got, whatever the sad death toll is, and infection rates, and we look at Western Europe and we see what's happened there, and we see what's still happening there. And you look at Shanghai, which is open, and people are going around without face masks, and life is returning to normality, frankly. They look at that and they say, well, maybe our government has delivered something, effective within this regard. So I think within that specific sort of context, I actually think that, the government in Beijing has come out of this, stronger. The real question is, of course, what happens to the economy? And if the economy is able to sort of pick up again at the rate that it was before, and they're able to re-employ a lot of the people who lost their jobs during the pandemic, then I think that kind of sense of optimism, in some ways, that you have within China, which is that sense that, well, tomorrow will be better than today, and the economy will continue to boom in this way, then, people will continue to sort of be happy with the social compact that they have. If that starts to falter, then I think you'd start to see problems. But at the moment, I'm afraid I don't see that.
I don't think there'll be a fundamental shift in Russia either, for reasons that I mentioned in my prepared comments, that things are so bad already that the expectations of the state are so low that this hasn't actually undermined faith in a social contract already. The pressures that were already on the social contract in Russia remain the same. It is no longer the case that, yes, we'll make everybody's standard of living rise in return for people keeping quiet about politics and major social issues. Instead, we're returning to a situation that is more normal for Russia. And this is why I think it doesn't, the second part of the question, it doesn't point to future political instability, because it's perfectly normal for that social contract to be extremely one-sided, for the state to hold all of the rights and the individual to hold absolutely none. And again, this is one of the ways in which a lot of the trends we see in Russia at the moment are more like returning to a default state and a default political and social condition in Russia after an anomaly that lasted about a quarter of a century after the end of the Soviet Union. So yes, people are upset at their government. Yes, they're upset at their government in comparable ways to what we see in the West in terms of the response to the coronavirus pandemic. But no, this is perfectly normal for Russia, and it's not going to change anything. Nicole?
All right, thank you. So our next question is from someone named David, and they've said, to what extent, if any, has COVID influenced or changed the relationship between Russia and China with respect to the Middle East, especially Iran?
I think, again, I'll defer to Raffaello on this one, because as Raffaello already mentioned, it is China that has stepped up now and made this very overt step with Iran, with a very definite and explicit outcome. So really, in that case, Russia is taking a bit of a backseat. How does it look to you, Raffaello?
Thank you, Keir. I mean, I'd agree. I think that, what's interesting in some ways is what has caused this kind of shift with Iran in particular. And I think actually it's something that probably isn't necessarily related to COVID. It's really related with the United States. There's a sense of the relationship with the United States has gotten to the point where it no longer really matters. Because it was interesting. Previously, you saw Chinese companies were actually careful about investing in Iran because they were very concerned about the impact of sanctions on them. And so you saw CNPC, for example, walking away from quite big deals. People were reticent. Chinese investors were careful about going there because they were worried about, what could happen, when the US cudgel of sanctions came down on them. So they're very aware of that. Now, with this big public deal that's been signed, it's very clearly a kind of poke in the eye to the Americans to say, you know what? Doesn't matter anymore. You guys are going to, sanction us and go after us anyway. We're going to go ahead and support the Iranians and do this and undermine your sanctions, your maximum pressure policy towards them to give the Iranians a bit more space to do what they want. So actually, I don't think that's related necessarily to COVID. I think what's interesting about the COVID twist is that, I think it was a very difficult one actually for the two governments to manage, because it was, Iran, I think, was one of the first countries, or I can't quite remember if it was Iran or Italy or South Korea, which really got hit by COVID initially directly from China. And so, it was sort of China was first, and then you saw it happening else. And I think Iran was either the first or the second. And that, the pandemic has really wrought havoc, from what I understand, in Iran. It's been a real kind of disaster, a real human disaster, and it's gotten to the point where you had sort of senior health officials basically complain about information that Chinese were giving them, saying it wasn't accurate, it wasn't true. And, escalating this to that kind of level, I think, really reflects the kind of public anger. And actually, interestingly, we've got a presidential election happening next year in Iran, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who I'm sure everyone remembers with great affection, the very vitriolic president of Iran during President George Bush's administration, who is running to be president next year, he's actually running on a platform where he's attacking this big deal because he senses that there's enough sort of public fear and concern about China, in part as a result of the pandemic, that he thinks that this is a real vote winner for him and something that he wants to sort of ride. So he's actually writing on a platform saying this deal is bad for Iran, it's good for China, but negative for the country, you know, on a very kind of nationalist platform. And that is, I think, to some degree, maybe related to COVID and the fact that you have got already a kind of latent sense of concern about China, which you find in a lot of sort of countries that are near it because of its size, its scale, its sort of power and sort of fear of that, but actually enhanced in particular as a result of the pandemic and because it's hit Iran quite so badly. So I think that that dynamic has been influenced to some degree by COVID, but I think the overriding one is this one of, you know, this 25-year deal that's been signed really is about China and Iran sort of poking their fingers in the United States side, but also really opening up a big market and opportunity for Beijing. Back to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you. So our next question is from someone at DSTL, and they've said, at what point do you think that the change in strategic narrative of the Russian careful diplomatic relationship with China will occur? And if a second or third major wave occurs, and if China becomes increasingly condemned by the international community and its response to handle it, what will be the tipping point?
I'd like to bring this back to the point I made earlier about Russia being in denial about all of its problems. You could ask that, what will be the tipping point when Russia finally faces up to these looming problems for all of those three different things? And I think historical experience, if it tells us anything, it tells us that'll be much further down the track than we're actually expecting. So Russia, for its own notions of its own security, will continue to try to keep China on side in order to push back the China problem for as long as is feasible, and longer than we would actually expect to be feasible. So we've seen already that they are willing to take steps to isolate themselves from China to a limited extent if China is seen as the source of the infection, and I would think we would see that again if a second and third wave does occur. But that is a very long way away from actually condemning China for being the source of the infection in the first place. So the specific question always is, what is the tipping point? And really, it's impossible to tell at this point, but it'll be much, much further away than it would be for any other country with a relationship with China.
So I mean, really just to build on what Keir said, which I agree with 100%. I think that in some ways I'm gonna presume to predicate what this question is edging towards, which is, where is that fissure between China and Russia, and how can we kind of pry into that, which is a question I've heard repeatedly. And I think it misses a fundamental point, which is that the reason that Russia and China sort of see themselves some sort of geopolitical alliance at the moment is because they see themselves collectively as against the West and against the kind of democratizing West that they see. They see color revolutions, you know, stretching back to the early 2000s, going through the Arab revolutions, going through, you know, the Arab Spring, sorry. You know, they see that as a sort of continuum, which ultimately is focused on bringing down their regimes. And so that is their kind of fundamental starting point for their kind of alignment together. And so within that, there may be all sorts of disputes and problems that may articulate themselves in some way. But I think it's going to take a regime change, frankly, in one capital or the other for, you know, there to really be a material shift in their willingness to sort of focus on each other as the priority partner versus the West. And I think that is kind of the fundamental point to look at. You may always see divisions and problems, and we've seen lots of problems recently between the two, and they sort of continually show up. You know, you continually hear stories of complaint and concern in Moscow about Beijing, and similarly Beijing says, oh gosh, Moscow is such an unreliable ally. But, you know, at the same time, they're always going to remain kind of bound together when it comes to looking towards the West. And whenever they kind of play these games of saying to us, oh, well, actually, you know, and we can see this with Russia to some degree now. Russia is starting to give off noises that actually, you know, we're getting a little, and we're, you know, we would like to work more with the West and with the United States. I think I would be very careful about buying that line and following it, because I think at the end of the day, they will ultimately default to each other. So yeah, that would be my thoughts on that. Please, back to you, Nicole.
All right, well, thank you everyone for dialing in today. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of our team session. If you had a question that wasn't answered, just feel free to email me and I will send the questions over to our speakers. But thank you, Mr. Giles and Mr. Raffaello Pantucci for taking the time to present. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation. Goodbye.